Judy, do you recall earlier, there was questioning on the issue of the noise estimates, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And Mr. Kosicki asked you about some of your prior estimates and in particular on the eastern side, the estimate that you had for the property line as compared with the estimate that you had for the closest neighbor on Curtis Ave, which is also to the east, correct?
Correct.
And you were going to investigate why it was that the neighbors' estimated sound levels were slightly higher than the property line. Have you been able to investigate that?
I have. I've looked back at my worksheets and that show me how my calculations were done. And if you can imagine, I'm going to use this sheet up here just to illustrate that we have two inverter stations that are fairly widely separated. And
just for clarity, the witness is pointing to the SFS 10K6.
And so there are two inverter stations, and each was modeled as a sound source. When I did the eastern boundary, I simply drew a straight line over here and averaged that sound. And when I look at the calculation for 218 Curtis Avenue, I see that the distance from each station is approximately the same. I don't know which one 218 is, but it turns out that because the nearest residence is closer to this particular station, and this, which is station, North Station, it is quite a bit louder than this station, and that dominates the calculation. So I would say that this third courthouse down is the 218 Curtis Avenue, and its sound is dominated by this, whereas for the overall, I averaged a point and came across here. So the difference is we have two sound sources, which makes the triangulation a little bit different, and the sound level that I've said for 218 Curtis Avenue, which is the 17.9 decibels, it is logical that it would be slightly higher than 17.9 at the property line.
Sorry, it's 17.9 at the residence, 17.6 at the property line?
Oh, no, I was saying that that property line measurement was at a different
No, I
point.
understand that.
Yeah, so I would say that at that point of the property line, off of 218 Curtis Avenue, the sound level, and it's about 30 feet away, might be slightly higher than 17.9. It might be 18 decibels.
Okay.
May I ask a couple of follow-ups to that, just to sort of unpack that a little bit? First question is, so if I understand this correctly, and please correct me if I don't, when you, in order to establish the sound levels that you have in your testimony related to each of the four property lines, what you did was you used cardinal directions from each of the inverter stations in each direction, and then averaged the two sound levels wherever those cardinal directions led you to.
I don't think he said that he averaged.
No, I did.
Okay.
What I did, and perhaps my testimony as to using cardinal directions is incorrect, because I took both sound sources to a common point on the perimeter. So my calculation for the east property line indicates 605 feet from Station 1 and 760 from Station 2. So 650 from here and 760. And in order to get a sound source, I had to bring them together to a common point. So it's not exactly a cardinal direction, but I did bring them to a point to average them. But my calculations showing Curtis Avenue show different distance numbers where one of the stations is quite a bit more dominant.
And then so sort of a follow-up to that question is it's a sort of a reiteration of my initial question I asked you before, which is, so that methodology does not necessarily reflect the highest sound level at any given property line. It is.
That is correct. I did not search for the highest sound level at any point along that property line. And part of the reason I didn't is the sound levels were so low, almost below audibility, below being able to be heard with the ambient sound levels, that I did not think it was necessary. But I have not proved out the highest sound level at any point.
And the last question I have real quick is so in that list of the sound levels, the line that is the sound level at the nearest residence, residence nearest to what exactly?
I would like to find which 218 Curtis Avenue is.
But isn't it simply nearest to the sound source?
If I could frame it a different way, so if there are two sound sources that are used, is it residence closest to the nearest sound source? Is it closest to the average between those two sound sources? I'm just trying to get a sense of
Okay, I think, without having the numbers on here, but what I think I did is I said, oh, this inverter is, which is station number 1, is closest to here, so I'm going to find the closest residence to this inverter station. So I selected a residence, and let's say it's this is 218, and I drew a line over there and drew a line from here. So I didn't, I found the residence that was closest to a inverter station.
One last question. Would I be correct to assume that if you are taking the closest residence to the closest sound source, that number would be the loudest, the highest levels of any residence around the project?
That is my assumption.
Thank you.
Follow up to that, in your calculations, do you take into account the vegetation buffer between?
Not at all. So no attenuation for the trees. And in the original plan, some of these trees were going to be cut, and now we have a 100-foot forest buffer. So these sound levels will be greatly attenuated, but because we don't know what that attenuation exactly is, I assumed there's no vegetation between the inverters and residents.
On the north side, I think that's where you had the highest noise level.
Yes, that is correct, because the north inverter station, this is the shortest distance to a property.
How close from that point is the nearest residence in the north direction?
South 40 Solar, or Keystone Development owns Sunset Cliff Road and across to the north. So I am not sure.
If I may show the witness an exhibit that could help.
Sure.
And I'm showing him MK3.
So I'm looking at MK3, and it shows the nearest residences are several hundred feet past Sunset Cliff Road, at about this area of the project here somewhere.
quite a difference in terrain there too, as I remember, is it? Or is it-
There is, and there is, of course, forest buffer.
Lee, with respect to the question of fencing, let me just ask the most basic question. Would you agree, would the petitioner agree to a CPG condition that requires that any fencing that is installed is compliant with the applicable electrical codes?
I would like to first review the NESC electrical code.
Well, Lee, let focus on the question I'm asking you is simply, would the applicant agree to a CPG condition that requires that its fencing be compliant with the electrical codes? I'm not asking you whether the fencing that's proposed, I'm not asking you to determine whether the wooden fencing is compliant. Would the applicant agree to a CPG condition that requires that it be compliant?
Yes, we could, and my caveat is that there are two codes that govern fencing, NEC and NESC. And for certain projects, like Ferrisburg Solar Farm, we have requested a waiver from NESC because the fence height was 6 feet for agricultural purposes, and that was granted. So that is my, if I'm willing to say that we will meet both codes, but in some cases, it could be preferable for all parties to have a fence that meets NEC codes, but not NESC. But at this point, I think it is easy enough to say that we will meet both codes with our fencing, but that may require double fencing.
You don't know that today?
I do not.
Because you have not had a chance to look at the code since we last talked about this.
That is correct.
We don't have anything further. We would be happy to supplement, if you want something supplemental on this issue, you can provide it.
I think that would be helpful, especially because there are two associations who've signed agreements.
Well, let me just say that it is more than essential that we not disturb those settlement agreements by changing the fencing. And so I think our goal is to, A, determine that whether that fencing is already compliant in its proposed state, and if it's not compliant, determine what the next step would be, whether it's double fencing or changing the fencing. But at a minimum, all of those agreements, as you know, like any settlement agreement, were carefully negotiated, and we don't want to upset those apple trees.
Andy, if I may,
Yeah.
just one for my own clarification. We also have an agreement. And our agreement is primarily concerned with the resource to the south of the array. And as I understand the conversation on the fencing and the possibility of changing fencing or adding a second row of fencing, shall we say, as I sit here today and I understand the additional work that needs to be done in that area, I don't envision that changing anything on the south side of the array between the array and the natural community. Am I correct?
I think that's true. I mean, it's not going to go further south, for example, if that's your point. I think it's already depicted as the furthest point south that it would be.
Yes, there's some on the west side, but it's on the west side.
Correct, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And the other fencing we're talking about is on the
Sorry,
north.
So if your point, yeah, so none of the fencing that goes this way is at issue. The only fencing that the hearing officers have focused on is this piece here and that piece there. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to the western side and to the northern side.
It's only a portion of that.
What's that?
It's only a
It's
portion.
only a portion of that.
It's only a portion. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I have one more housekeeping.
Mhm.
The letter that you dated November 5th, 2015, and that was prior to revisions to the plans. Did you share the revisions with that?
What's odd is we only got that letter well after the fact, and they're not a party in the case, and the revisions are all reductive. I mean, it made the project smaller, so I guess the short answer is we haven't shared the plans because they chose not to be a party in the case, but because everything we've done is make the project smaller, it's hard to see why you would, it's a little bit like the substantial change test where we've only minimized impacts. We haven't, there's no potential for the impacts to be greater if in fact we've made the footprint smaller and we've added more landscaping.
And the city is aware of that?
The city is aware of it. The city's settlement agreement was recent. And,
I wondered why it was coming so late.
we were trying to figure out when it came in, because I don't recall that we received it actually at that time, but the board, and let me just maybe state the obvious. The board has, that letter was sent to the board, and I believe it's addressed to the board, is it not?
It is.
Yeah, so it is under 248B1, the board can consider, quote, the recommendations of the RPC. We would like it to be technically in the record, but I think you are obligated to consider recommendations of the RPC without regard to whether we put it into the record.
Just curious about the revision aspect,
Yeah.
but I'm satisfied. So are there any further housekeeping?
We would like to talk about a schedule for briefs and reply briefs. I would propose, so I think it's relatively apparent that the number of contested issues in this case are relatively small, and there are settlement agreements with the vast majority of parties. So I don't think we need a tremendous amount of time for briefing in this case. We would recommend, and our hope is that we could get briefing done, both the main brief and the reply brief, before we hit the July 4th holiday. So I would like to propose the main brief by June 15th, and the reply brief 10 days after that. Or 10 days would be weekend, so
27?
the 27th, so 15th and the 27th.
June 27th.
When will the transcript be available?
Well, within 2 weeks, but probably the end of next week.
And if we needed an expedited transcript?
I put it in on Tuesday. Working the weekend, Tuesday.
Tuesday would be the earliest if we ruined your weekend. Let's
Yes.
not ruin your weekend.
I'm not rude, yeah, I'm never
What's that?
rude.
Or long weekend.
Or long weekend.
Long weekend.
So when?
Yes, so probably, no, it'll be Friday if it's normal delivery, because I've got other stuff going this week too.
Okay.
Let me just say, I can accommodate that briefing schedule for the regular transcript delivery. I'm not really.
I'd like 2 weeks from receipt of the transcript to be able to brief.
Just the 17th.
So the 17th of June.
I don't have a calendar in front of me.
So if we did the 17th, could we just keep the 27th? That would be 10 days for reply brief.
That's
Is
fine.
that agreeable?
Yep.
That's fine.
Okay. And, let's see, are there anything other than the fencing that you wanted the petitioner to follow up on? I feel like we went back and cleaned up a few things.
Do you want to update the spec sheets for the invaders?
Right.
Clarification of the module size and revised plans or specifications?
Right.
I think that was
What is it?
we can, I think we can do that within the next week.
Are there any other issues to discuss before we adjourn? Okay, we'll hear it adjourn.
Thank you.